In 1996, Ford Motor Company committed $2.5 billion to restoring Jaguar's identity. The company had owned the British mark for 7 years, and the mandate was clear: build a car that looked and felt like a Jaguar again. Not the XJS. Anything but the XJS. The replacement had to do more than succeed. It had to reset the brand. The result was the XK8. It introduced a new design language, a new platform, and a new engine. For a brief moment, it worked. The car was received as the return Jaguar had been trying to engineer. But that moment did not last. Because inside the new AJV8 engine, a single component would determine whether the car fulfilled that promise or destroyed it. A timing chain tensioner made from plastic. Under repeated heat cycles, the material would fatigue and crack, losing oil pressure without warning. When it failed, the engine destroyed itself. The failure was invisible until it was final. So how does a program backed by billions of dollars come down to a part that costs almost nothing? To understand that, you have to look at the decisions made long before the car ever reached production. The XJS had been a problem for Jaguar since the day it replaced the E-Type in 1975. Not because it was a bad car. It was actually quite competent, but it carried an impossible weight. The E-Type had defined a generation. It had proven that a Jaguar didn't need to be just another expensive sedan. It could be sculpture. It could move like desire. And then the XJS arrived, and it was wedge-shaped and practical and thoroughly of its time. Jaguar survived the next 2 decades by simply waiting for the world to forget what it had lost. By the late 1980s, that waiting had become unbearable. The XJS was still selling, but it felt like a car from another era. The proportions had gone blocky. The design language had calcified. When Ford acquired Jaguar in 1989, one of the first strategic decisions was inevitable: get rid of it. Build something that could reclaim the visual territory the brand had abandoned since 1975. The brief went to Jeff Lawson, the designer who understood something fundamental about Jaguar's identity. Lawson didn't start with a blank sheet. He went back to the E-Type and studied it like a manuscript. Not to copy it, to understand the grammar of it, the proportions, the long bonnet that seemed to stretch forever, the fastback roofline that suggested movement while the car sat still, the short overhangs that made the wheels look like they barely fit. These weren't decorative choices, they were philosophical statements about what a Jaguar should be. When the XK8 arrived in 1996, the automotive press reacted with something close to relief. The long bonnet was back. The proportions felt right. The fastback silhouette echoed the E-Type without borrowing directly from it. Road and Track called it a masterpiece of modern proportion. Autocar praised the restraint of the design. Car and Driver noted that this was the car Jaguar should have built 21 years earlier. The reviews weren't just positive, they were grateful. Nobody was comparing it unfavorably to anything anymore. The E-Type was history. The XJS was finally, mercifully, forgotten. Jaguar had a new standard bearer, and it arrived looking like the best version of itself that the modern world could afford to build. But that long bonnet, the feature that defined the car's entire character, only existed because of what lived underneath it. The AJV8 was a compact engine, much narrower and shorter than the V12 it replaced. This packaging advantage allowed Jaguar's engineers to position the engine lower and further back in the chassis. That positioning made the long, low bonnet profile possible. The beauty and the engineering were inseparable. For about 3 years, they worked perfectly together. The AJV8 wasn't just an engine, it was Jaguar's first completely new V8 architecture in decades. Prior Jaguars had borrowed from older engine families, stretched and revised and coaxed into service. The AJ was different. It was engineered from zero, designed specifically for a modern era that valued efficiency alongside power. Ford's acquisition gave Jaguar something it had lacked for years: access to genuine engineering resources. The collaboration between Jaguar's engine team and Ford's development group produced something neither company could have achieved alone. The result was a compact aluminum V8 that could compete directly with BMW's M60 and Mercedes' M113. Jaguar called it a masterpiece of packaging. The automotive press agreed. The engine displaced 4 liters. The naturally aspirated version produced 290 horsepower. The supercharged XKR variant, fitted with an Eaton M112 Roots-type positive displacement blower, delivered 370. These weren't the highest numbers in the Grand Touring segment, but they were respectable, modern, engineered with a precision that suggested Jaguar finally understood what the market expected. The engine bay itself told the story, all aluminum. Both block and cylinder head cast from aluminum, dual overhead camshafts per bank, 4 valves per cylinder, 32 total. This was technology that belonged in the late 1990s. It felt intentional. It felt designed with care. What made the AJ remarkable wasn't just raw power. It was the thinking behind every detail. The compact dimensions of the engine meant that Jaguar could position it lower and further back in the chassis than had been possible with previous power plants. That packaging advantage rippled through every other engineering decision. Lower center of gravity, better weight distribution, the ability to create that iconic long bonnet without sacrificing engine access or serviceability. The aluminum construction kept mass down, a heavy Grand Tourer that somehow didn't drive like one. The suspension geometry could work with the engine's modest footprint to create something that felt genuinely athletic on a highway, despite the car's obvious orientation toward touring rather than racing. Ford's investment extended beyond just the engine itself. The AJ V8 was engineered to power the entire Jaguar lineup simultaneously. The XK8 Sport Coupe and convertible received it first, but the plan was always to deploy it across the range. The XJ8 flagship saloon used the same engine, the S-Type sports sedan as well, a single-engine family powering 3 distinct Jaguar models, from the youngest enthusiast buyers to the established wealthy. This was the scale of the engineering commitment. It wasn't a sports car engine that happened to fit in a sedan. It was a modern V8 that Jaguar expected to carry the brand into a new century. Everything was being bet on this engine's reliability, efficiency, and ability to represent Jaguar's ambitions. The timing was deliberate. The AJ V8 arrived at the exact moment when the automotive industry was transitioning from analog to digital engine management. Fuel injection that understood octane ratings and combustion temperatures in real time. Variable valve timing that optimized for both power and economy. All aluminum construction that would last hundreds of thousands of miles if treated with respect. This was the future of the Grand Tourer, or so it seemed. An engine that was thoroughly modern, but built with an appreciation for engineering heritage. A car that could speak to both yesterday and tomorrow. While the engine was a marvel of packaging, it carried something hidden inside. Something that would outlast the engineers who designed it, outlast the accountants who approved the materials, and outlast the optimism of 1996. The timing chain tensioner in early AJ V8 production looked like nothing that should cause problems. It was a hydraulic component, a small mechanism that lived in the engine's front cover. Its job was simple and essential. It maintained tension on the timing chain that orchestrated the camshaft dance. Without proper chain tension, the valves would slap against the pistons. The engine would destroy itself. So the tensioner was designed to use oil pressure to hold tension against a spring-loaded plunger. As long as oil pressure existed, the chain stayed tight. It was elegant engineering, proven technology, standard practice across the industry. Except Jaguar chose to make the tensioner body from plastic. Not the entire component, the critical housing that contained the hydraulic chamber and the spring mechanism, plastic. In an environment that routinely reached temperatures that made plastic soften and lose structural integrity. The theory was simple enough: weight savings, cost reduction. The aluminum engine could shed another few grams if the tensioner didn't have to be cast iron or aluminum. A traditional manufacturer might have hesitated. Jaguar, racing against time to deliver a finished product into an already delayed launch timeline, accepted the compromise. The failure mode was specific and brutal. When oil pressure dropped, the plastic body would flex under the tension of the spring. Over thermal cycles, the plastic fatigued. Microfractures appeared. Eventually, the body would crack. Not catastrophically at first. Just enough that oil pressure would bleed off through the fracture. The hydraulic support would fail. The spring would push the tensioner arm away from the chain, and the chain, no longer held under tension, would begin to slap. First a rattle on cold start, then a skip, then a jump that bent a valve, cracked a piston, destroyed the engine from the inside out. A complete engine replacement cost $5,000 or more. The failed tensioner itself probably cost $15,000, maybe $20,000. The cost differential was catastrophic, and in the early production years, they failed. Warranty claims began arriving at Jaguar dealers within 2 years. The technical service bulletins started circulating in 1998. VIN ranges were identified where the tensioner was higher risk. Revision specifications were issued. Retrofit procedures were documented. All of this happened in the background, while the automotive press was still celebrating the XK8's beauty. The obvious question, the one that echoes through every Jaguar forum today, is why? Why plastic? Why not aluminum or iron? The answer usually points to the accountants, the people responsible for cost targets and manufacturing budgets. Jaguar needed to hit a price point. Ford's investment was enormous, but it wasn't infinite. A few dollars saved on 10,000 tensioners added up. The calculation was straightforward. Most customers would drive their cars regularly. Most customers would start them frequently. The cold start risk was manageable if you treated the car right, if you did everything correctly, if you never let it sit. But that assumption was about to meet reality in a way that nobody at Jaguar seemed to have anticipated. The real danger wasn't just the plastic. It was how grand touring cars actually lived in the real world. And that story belonged to the owners who bought these machines expecting them to be forever cars. Here is where the story shifts from engineering to human reality. An XK8 that sits in a garage for 3 weeks is a different proposition than one driven 4 times a week. The plastic tensioner doesn't care about intention. It doesn't reward the owner who parks the car carefully and covers it with a tarp. If anything, the pampered car is in greater danger. The reason lives in something called the oil pressure gap. When an engine shuts down, oil pressure drops to 0. The oil that was suspended in the tensioner circuit during running will begin to drain back into the pan. In a car that starts regularly, this doesn't matter. New oil is immediately circulated under pressure the moment ignition begins. The tensioner arm gets pushed back against the chain within seconds. The chain stays tight. But when a car sits for weeks without starting, the oil drains completely from the tensioner body. It pools in the engine block below. The next time those keys turn, something terrifying happens. For the first 2 or 3 seconds of a cold start, before the oil pump has built sufficient pressure, the tensioner has no hydraulic support. The spring pushes the arm away from the chain. The chain, suddenly slack, begins to slap against the inside of the engine cover. That sound, a metallic rattle, almost rhythmic, definitely wrong, is what every XK8 owner learns to dread. It's the sound of your warranty being spent. If the oil pressure doesn't build fast enough, the chain doesn't just rattle, it skips. The timing jumps. A valve opens into a descending piston and bends catastrophically. Or a piston crown cracks. Or the entire valve train synchronization collapses and destroys itself in a cascade of mechanical violence. This is the irony that made the XK8's reputation. A car driven daily is mostly safe. A car driven twice a week is mostly safe. A show car, a weekend car, a second vehicle kept pristine in a climate-controlled garage. This car is the one most likely to suffer a cold start failure. The situation grew worse because of 2 factors that Jaguar didn't adequately account for. The first was oil consumption. The aluminum AJ-V8 had valve stem seals that leaked oil at moderate mileage. Owners might not notice. They'd check the level periodically, maybe not often enough. An engine running low on oil has less pressure at startup. The window during which the tensioner is unsupported stretches. The risk multiplies. The second factor was the fuel itself. Throughout the late 1990s, gasoline contained sulfur. High sulfur fuel created acidic combustion byproducts that attacked the Nicosil lining inside the aluminum cylinders. Nicosil is a special nickel silicon composite that protects aluminum from direct contact with piston rings. When sulfur corroded it, the cylinder walls degraded. Compression suffered. Oil consumption climbed. An XK8 burning oil in an era of sulfur-heavy fuel was in a slow-motion crisis that wouldn't fully manifest until something stressed the engine hard. Like a cold start with low pressure and slack chain tension, real owners began telling stories. A 1998 XK8 with 8,000 miles on the odometer. Garaged, maintained perfectly. One cold start in February after 6 weeks of sitting, and the engine made that noise. 2 weeks later, the diagnosis came: catastrophic valve damage, $30,000 repair. Another owner, a 1999 coupe with 12,000 miles. The car was driven every other week. Someone forgot to check the oil during the winter. At 31,000 miles, same scenario, same sound, same outcome. These weren't stories of neglect. These were stories of cars being treated exactly how their owners thought Grand Tours should be treated: carefully, respectfully, protectively. And it didn't matter. Jaguar knew by the early 2000s that they had a profound reputation crisis. The solution, when it finally arrived in 2003, would redefine what the XK8 could be. Jaguar spent 5 years issuing technical service bulletins and retrofit kits while the reputation it had earned in 1996 slowly corroded. The damage was already done in the marketplace by the time the company decided to act decisively. The decision came in 2003. The engine would grow, the tensioner would be redesigned completely, and a car that had been treated as a liability would finally become something worth defending. The displacement increase from 4 liters to 4.2 was more than just boring out the cylinders. The larger engine required revised cylinder head ports to manage the increased flow. The compression ratio shifted. The engine management software was completely rewritten. Horsepower climbed from 290 to 294 in the naturally aspirated version, a modest gain that understated the real transformation. The supercharged XKR jumped from 370 to 396. But the real story wasn't the numbers on a spec sheet. It was the 3rd-generation tensioner. This new tensioner abandoned plastic entirely. Jaguar returned to metal for the critical housing. Not the tentative compromise of a partially revised design, a complete rethinking of how to manage chain tension without relying on a hydraulic system vulnerable to pressure drops. The metal body could handle thermal cycling. It wouldn't fatigue under repeated stress. It wouldn't crack at a microscopic level and bleed pressure into failure. Owners in the specialist forums called it vindication. Jaguar had finally been forced to build what they should have built in 1996. The 2003 update brought more than just an engine revision. The transmission received attention as well. The ZF 5-speed automatic that had served the entire lineup was respected, but aging. By 2003, 6-speed automatics were becoming standard in the luxury segment. The later XK80S received the upgraded gearbox in markets where it was available. The efficiency improved, the refinement climbed. The shift logic became more responsive. A car that had felt competent in 1997 felt genuinely modern by the middle of the decade. The exterior received a refresh as well. Updated headlamps with more sophisticated reflector design, a revised grille that echoed the original proportions without borrowing directly from them, new rear lighting that incorporated more contemporary LED technology. These weren't revolutionary changes. The long bonnet remained, the fastback roofline stayed true, but Jaguar had made the subtle decision to bring the visual language forward without erasing what had made the car distinctive in the first place. The interior received better materials. The navigation system was updated. The instrument cluster was revised for clarity. What emerged from the factory at Castle Bromwich after 2003 was a car that represented the actual peak of the X100 platform's engineering. Every lesson learned from the early failures had been implemented. Every problem that warranty claims had documented had been addressed. In a just world, these 2003 to 2006 examples would have been celebrated as the definitive version of the XK8. Instead, they arrived to market as an attempt at reputation repair. Many potential buyers had already made their decision. The reviews in 1996 had been rapturous. The reviews for the 2003 update were respectful, but carried an undertone of regret, like watching someone finally get it right after a decade of stumbling. The longevity comparison was stark. An early 4-liter XK8 with an original tensioner was a time bomb. A 2003 to 2006 4.2 example with a metal tensioner was genuinely dependable. Both were the same car, wore the same proportions, represented the same design philosophy, but one was mechanically fragile while the other could actually deliver on the promise of permanence that grand touring cars were supposed to represent. This mechanical renaissance happened quietly, against a backdrop of another engineering decision that had been unfolding in parallel, one that suggested Jaguar understood structural engineering in ways that wouldn't become obvious until years later. While the engine dominated the conversation about reliability, something else was happening in the engineering offices at Castle Bromwich. Jaguar faced a problem that most manufacturers would have found insurmountable. The X100 platform wasn't a ground-up design. It was a heavily modified version of the XJS steel chassis, a platform that had been in production since 1975. Building a new sports car on a legacy steel architecture from an older generation was the opposite of cutting edge. It was a constraint. It was a budget reality, but constraints sometimes force the best engineering decisions. The XJS chassis, by 1996 standards, was ancient. It had been stretched, revised, and coaxed through 2 decades of modifications. Its steel construction was heavy. Its proportions reflected the wedge-shaped design language of the 1970s. Every engineer who worked on the X100 knew they weren't starting fresh. They were performing architectural surgery on a patient that had already survived twice as long as anyone had originally intended. The mandate from Ford was clear: make this car feel modern. Don't sound like you're driving a refined version of something built when disco was still relevant. The compact AJV8 made this possible in ways that extended far beyond engine bay packaging. A shorter, narrower engine meant engineers could position the entire powertrain lower and further back in the chassis. That single decision rippled through every other engineering constraint. The long bonnet became possible not just as a stylistic choice, but as a structural consequence of better engine placement. The center of gravity dropped. The weight distribution improved. On a legacy steel platform that was inherently heavy, every kilogram mattered. Every millimeter of center of gravity reduction made the suspension geometry work harder on the driver's behalf. The suspension geometry deserves its own moment here. Double wishbone independent suspension at all 4 corners was the opposite of cost-cutting on a car that might have used McPherson struts to save money. Double wishbones required more complex geometry, more precision in manufacturing, more attention to control arm geometry and bushing selection. But paired with the improved weight distribution the AJV8 made possible, the suspension could actually do what it was designed to do. Road tests in 1997 immediately recognized something unexpected. A car built on steel architecture from 1975, updated with modern engineering, handled with a balance and precision that seemed impossible for its mass and height. The suspension could maintain consistent tire contact through corners. The ride quality never sacrificed responsiveness for comfort. This was what modernization looked like when you didn't have the luxury of a completely new platform. Engineers making old steel work like new steel through careful geometry and precise mass management. The steel construction meant different long-term challenges than a more contemporary platform might have faced. Steel rusts. It corrodes. It requires protection. Jaguar's paint and rust-proofing specifications were comprehensive for the era, but steel chassis age. They oxidize. Owners of high-mileage examples today often find that structural rust has progressed further than the body panels suggest. The undercarriage, the floor pans, the mounting points for suspension components. These steel structures live in a different timeline than the aluminum engine they support. A 2005 XK8 might have a pristine-looking body, while the chassis underneath shows its 1975 origins through creeping corrosion. Castle Bromwich maintained 2 separate production lines throughout the X100's run. The XK8 Sports Coupe and convertible shared space with the XJ Saloon, a completely different category of vehicle assembled at the same facility. This wasn't because Jaguar had infinite manufacturing capacity. It was a consequence of Jaguar's production scale in the Ford era. Low enough that separate facilities made no economic sense. The shared space, paradoxically, preserves something analog about the manufacturing process: hand assembly skills, individual attention to fit and finish. The sense that someone, somewhere, actually built this car, rather than it simply being stamped and assembled by industrial logic alone. The X100 represented a bridge between 2 eras of automobile manufacturing. An aging steel architecture modernized through careful engineering decisions, not through the luxury of a blank sheet. a platform from the 1970s made to feel urgent and contemporary by the 1990s, hand-assembled by workers who understood what permanence meant, even when the skeleton underneath was inherited from an engine bay that predated them. The XK8 sits today at a curious valuation point. A well-maintained example costs between $8,000 and $20,000, depending on year and mileage. For that money, you acquire a grand touring coupe with handling dynamics that still compete with cars twice its price. The depreciation has been severe, but the opportunity it creates for buyers with specific knowledge is profound. An XK8 isn't a bargain in the sense of being underpriced for its utility. It's undervalued because the market has collectively decided the engine is unreliable. That collective memory is both accurate and outdated simultaneously. Any potential owner needs to understand the specific preventive discipline required. The 1997 to 2002 4-liter examples with original tensioners require particular vigilance. These cars demand shorter oil change intervals than Jaguar's factory specification. They demand frequent oil level checks between services. They demand immediate attention the moment the cold start begins to sound wrong. This isn't casual maintenance. This is mechanical penance, the price of entry into XK8 ownership. The enthusiast community has become the actual engineering department that Jaguar's factory never fully was. The specialists at XK8 Lovers and Jag Lovers forums have documented everything Jaguar's technical service bulletins addressed and extended that knowledge into practical owner guidance. The tensioner swap has evolved into a rite of passage. New owners learning about the risk immediately understand that the first service on any early car should be a tensioner inspection or replacement. Aftermarket upgrade kits exist. Metal tensioner replacements are now standard procedure. An owner who does this work at purchase has essentially eliminated the primary failure risk. What's remarkable is that people still buy these cars knowing all of this, knowing the history, knowing the risk, knowing what needs to be done, and they do the work. They perform the maintenance ritual. They drive carefully during cold starts. They check the oil more often than the manufacturer suggests. They treat the car with a deliberate discipline that seems to belong to another era entirely. Why would someone choose this burden when alternatives exist? The answer lives in how the XK8 looks in a driveway. It lives in the proportions that Jeff Lawson spent months studying. It lives in the long bonnet that was only possible because engineers made one good decision about engine packaging. An XK8 parked in sunlight still reads as a masterpiece of design. The mechanical risk doesn't erase the visual permanence. If anything, the knowledge of what lives beneath that beautiful body makes the maintenance ritual feel like a privilege rather than a burden. This is the strange calculus of automotive enthusiasm. A car with a documented failure mode remains desirable if the design is right. The XK8 proves something that accountants and engineers sometimes forget. Beauty has the power to outlast engineering mistakes. A car that was nearly destroyed by a plastic component is still worth saving because of how it looks and how it feels on a winding road. An owner accepts the penance because the reward justifies it. That rattle on cold start, the one from the opening, the sound that signals the plastic is failing. It doesn't have to be a death sentence. It's the opening move in a conversation between the owner and the machine. The conversation goes like this. You know what's happening. You know how to fix it. You do the work. And then the car becomes yours in a way that ownership rarely means anymore. An XK8 purchased today arrives with history and liability written across its warranty paperwork. But it also arrives as an education. Any buyer serious enough to research, one discovers the full forensic record. The 1997 to 2002 4-liter cars with original plastic tensioners are high risk. A 2003 to 2006 4.2 example with a metal tensioner is genuinely reliable. The ZF 5-speed transmission is respected but aged. Look for the 6-speed retrofit if available. Check the chassis for structural rust. Verify the oil consumption at idle. These aren't recommendations. They're the entry exam. The enthusiast community has already written the actual owner's manual Jaguar never quite produced. The specialists at the forums have documented every failure mode and created the repair protocols that should have existed in 1996. A new owner who does the tensioner replacement at purchase, who checks the oil religiously, who starts the engine gently on cold mornings, that owner has essentially eliminated the primary failure risk and acquired a genuinely beautiful Grand Tourer for $8,000 to $20,000. What if permanence didn't demand plastic compromises? What if it just required American steel and a philosophy that valued simplicity over sophistication? The next video explores exactly that contrast. The Lincoln Town Car represented a completely different solution to the same problem. How do you build a car that lasts forever? Click the video to discover how a completely different era solved that riddle.